We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management, archaeology, and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 193 for July 15th, 2020. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about a common concept in cultural resource management, recording resources to a good faith effort standard. What does that mean? So bust out your favorite Tom King book because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Bill in California.
Hello.
Doug in Scotland.
Hey, everyone.
And I forgot to mention Bill's in Northern California because we also have Heather in Southern California.
Or Central California. Hi, everyone.
Or I guess Central. Yeah, whatever. Everything south of San Francisco is Southern California to me. Well, then there's the Sierras. There's like 5 Californias and the Mojave. I don't know how many Californias there are.
I'm
all
just
right.
willing to say Southern California is my home. So.
Okay. And then Stephen in Calgary.
Hello.
And I'm actually not in Nevada. I never say where I'm at because I never leave, but I'm not in Nevada anymore. And I'm probably going to be in a different place almost every time we record for the next little while. But I'm in Oregon. I'm on the Oregon coast in Florence, Oregon. So that's where I am at right now. Okay, so this week, we've got somewhat of a random topic from our topic pool. We sometimes just write stuff down and we keep it on this service called Trello, and we pull some of these ideas up, and they're just concepts that we've had discussed in other areas or ideas we had or thoughts we've had, and that's going to be one of these episodes today. So Heather was perusing the list and pulled out one that we just wrote good faith effort on, and we'll start with that. So this was in response to a conversation that was being had on one of our Slack teams by one of our Slack members. And I'll just point out that as of July, we're recording this in July of 2020. So something could have changed 2 years from now if you're listening to this in the future. But we recently, and by recently, I mean in the last couple of weeks, took down all our membership tiers. We had 3 different membership tiers. We took them all down, and now we have one membership tier that I think is like $7.99 a month or something like that. You can get an annual for, I don't know, something like $60 a year or something. That's just enough to help us keep these things going. But one of the things that includes is our members-only Slack team. And Slack is a sort of a team communication device like Discord or something like that. But Slack is a great place to have a conversation with the hosts, have a conversation with other members, and basically just keep the conversation going from the podcast or start a new one. It doesn't matter. So Slack is where we got this idea. And if you want to join, head on over to arcpodnet.com and look for the members area and join and become a member today. So let's talk about good faith effort. What the heck does that mean? It's in pretty much every language that you see out there, but it's definitely in the Section 106 language that you must, record an archaeological site in good faith effort. I'm paraphrasing here. I don't have the documentation in front of me. Stephen probably has it memorized, but otherwise it's good faith effort. And that's what we're talking about. You have to assess the situation at a historical or cultural resource using good faith effort methodology, right? Basically. But what does that mean? What does that mean to different people? What is a good faith effort? The first thing to me that comes to mind is people's tendency to write off shovel tests and survey using slope and other conditions. That has got to be documented because that is part of your good faith effort. If you think there's a site on the top of a really tough to get to hill or something like that, or a scree slope or something that you can't climb up of, which is common in Nevada, and honestly, the use of drones would be really helpful so we can check out a flat spot up on top somewhere and really see if there's anything up there. If you can't get up there or something like that and you end up writing it off, the whole project is under your good faith effort ideology there. But if you've got to decide what does constitute a good faith effort for your area, for the particular sites that you're recording, how you're getting all these things done. So Heather, since you brought up this topic, how do you define this? How do you see good faith effort for your company and when you're out in the field?
Well, I think you kind of have to look at that the term good faith effort is kind of it's a funny term, but it is a legal term. And, even though we go to school and we have, this passion for this discipline and we have our reasons for doing what we do, but when it comes down to it, when it comes to CRM, we need to create, in the end, a defensible document. We have to be able to defend our actions. And why do we have to defend our actions? It's actually in a legal sense, right? I mean, we should be able to, when we go out and we have a task, we should do the very best that we can because of our moral obligations, but also there's a legal reason that we need to go and make sure that we are doing what we should be doing. And that is where good faith comes in, is actually a legal term. And I looked it up and it says it's an abstract and comprehensive term that encompasses a sincere belief or motive without any malice or desire to defraud others. So, wow. The one thing about, legal language is that it's broad on purpose, right? So now the difficult part is, have we as a discipline been able to codify what is a good faith effort well enough? So because we're always struggling with, doing the right thing out in the field, but at the same time, making sure that we're representing our company and our clients properly, it's actually not that, it's not that easy to define. And for me, I think it's looking, when you go into a site, when I first started, I worked for a company that actually would say they don't look at slopes. They don't look at any slopes because nothing could happen there. You couldn't have any sites there, right? So right. I do believe that their intent was, or the person that had kind of made that declaration, I don't think he had any desire to defraud others or any malice of any sort, but he certainly was closed-minded. So I think that for me, when I walk onto a site, part of going into a site and into a project with a good faith effort is to look at the site from all perspectives and to really try my best not to have a bias, but at the same time, bringing in the information that I have gathered over years of experience to know where to look. We have sampling, random sampling, but we also sample based on what we find. And so, I think it's just one, in a very broad sense, would be walking into a site with your experience behind you, but your opened eyes in front of you. How's that for not a nebulous answer?
There you go. It's a nebulous concept, though. But
yeah.
Steven's brought up in our chat here a link with what looks like a identification standard. Steven, you want to talk about that?
Sure, because I just basically Googled it while Heather was talking. Basically, what we pulled up and we'll have in the show notes is a PDF that's put out by the ACHP, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And it refers back to the thing I always bring up when we talk about Section 106 stuff, which is 36 CFR 800. That basically spells out the entire process, right? And part of that is it's not just good faith effort that it talks about, it's reasonable and good faith effort. They've got a few bullet points here. I think that, to summarize it in my own commentary is more along the lines of that it's conducting the inventory of historic properties, identifying historic properties in a way that could reasonably find historic properties if they were located within the area of potential effect. So maybe doing a windshield survey in the middle of winter when everything's covered in snow might not be the best, might not be considered a reasonable attempt at finding sites. Whereas if you go out there and you're going by whatever the local standards are for shovel testing intervals or transect intervals or whatever is considered to be the norm for your particular region, time period, whatever you're working with, that could be considered a reasonable good faith effort. Most jurisdictions, most states or areas or regions, you can find guidelines as to what constitutes like a professional standard, or I don't want to say too much standard, but like basically like, here's what we consider to be good practice in this area. And I mean, it's funny because you could like be on one side of a state line, it'll be like a 10-meter interval for shovel tests, and on the other side, it's a 15-meter interval. But you know, each state and you know, agencies, public land will have some sort of guidance as to what constitutes a reasonable attempt at finding, in this particular case, archaeological sites, but throughout historic properties as a whole.
Bill, I'm curious as to what you think about this, since you are teaching the next wave of eager young minds in these concepts. How do you deal with this? And is this a concept that even comes up in your classes at the level that you're teaching right now?
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you mentioned that because it doesn't actually come up, and it's definitely something that needs to be addressed. I definitely agree with Stephen and Heather that, you know, it's part of your own professional obligation based on your own experience. And the guideline for the advisory council guidelines, because I also pulled those up too. I think that like the key thing that's not necessarily mentioned here that's relevant for CRM folks is that, you know, the way this thing is set up, it's supposed to be between the lead agency and the, you know, specific groups. They're not very clear on which groups that are supposed to be consulted with and everything, and which group you are actually trying to do a good faith effort towards addressing their heritage. So, you know, there's always a gray area. And I think I mentioned when we were announced that we were going to talk about this, when I first started doing CRM, I remember my bosses telling me that, you know, good faith effort is just, you know, we're supposed to do good archaeology and do our best to try and identify historic properties, archaeology sites and buildings and stuff if they actually exist in our project area. But the whole good faith thing of communities and everything was supposed to be between the lead agency, and we were supposed to keep our mouths shut. And that was, you know, like, you know, don't do anything to get us sued. Just do the project, keep your mouth shut. And your good faith involves archaeology field work and reporting what you find, not connecting with communities.
You know, something I want to chime in on what you just said, though, what all of you said, I think, at least Bill, you just said it, talking about good faith effort being based on your experience and abilities, right? And what you've seen in archaeology sites. I mean, I think the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed too, especially for newer people that might be listening to this. We just had if you're listening to this in real time, I mean, we just had a group of people graduate with a degree in whatever that gets them into CRM archaeology. I feel bad that 2020 is the year they have to do that, but nonetheless, that has to come up, because if we all think back to our early careers in archaeology, when we were first in charge of recording an archaeological site, and by in charge, I just mean a crew chief, or maybe you're even put in charge of, you know, a set of features or something like that. But our skill levels have changed over the years. And I bet there isn't a single one of us that would go back if we could and re-record some of that stuff, because we know that the effort that we put in was probably not where it should be, because we've learned so much over the years, and you get better and better each year. And archaeology just doesn't have the time to train people to a level standard where everybody's good faith effort actually meets a legal standard that I think develops over years. And some people cross that line sooner than others.
You know, I think some really good points there. You know, as far as re-record, I was just thinking myself, recording or wishing you could go back. I think about this, you know, I dream about it, unfortunately, wishing, especially when it comes back up and it ends up being a hot topic that, you know, all of a sudden that site gets a lot of attention. You're like, oh my dear God. Did I please don't let anybody pull that report out, you know, just from when I was new. Not that I did anything on purpose, less than I should have, but I definitely have a lot more information now. But, you know, it's been, even with the COVID, it's been a conversation we've been having. I make a point, I never go out and survey until I've done the record search, period. Until I've done all the background and all the record search. To me, that's kind of a given. You need to know what else has been, or who else has been out there, what has been found. You're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Not only is it more efficient, but it also allows you to, you know, have a context when you're going out there. Now, of course, you know, there's a lot of, you know, reports that are less than stellar, but it's still good for you to understand what you're dealing with before you go out there. But now with this COVID, the record search, and we've talked about this in a little bit in other podcasts, is that now we're like 8 weeks behind. Like in some of these, Chris, in California at least, some of the record or the information centers, they have an 8-week turnaround, 10-week turnaround before you can get any results. Now, what are you supposed to do, right? So, but I do think in good practices to make sure that you're walking in with as much information as you could possibly have. And then I really like that Bill brought up talking to the people that the descendants, the people whose this culture, this site represents. And I think it is really important, and it's near and dear to my heart. In fact, I have a friend whose built environment is her specialty, and they had a conference this year, and there was a lot of talk about, how do we interpret, especially in the built environment, and what is important in the built environment that's still here that we want to preserve when we're not from that community. It's difficult to say for us to be making those decisions without incorporating their narrative and their perspective. But the one thing that I've learned just through experience is that it's always important as an archaeologist to definitely avail yourself of all that. We make a point of reaching out to the Native American community during our phase ones, our lower level initial surveys, that if it's possible to have them actually on the survey with us and to involve them, in that conversation, even in the beginning stages. And that to me is part of the good faith effort. But there's also, when you get into the nitty gritty, you get, let's say, a site that is really, you're right, it's the agency that needs to, the government to government concept. We are supposed to stand back as the consultant, even though we're still part of it, but we're supposed to stand back away from it. I think that it's important for us to remember that we are still coming from an archaeological perspective. What we consider archaeologically significant or archaeologically important is not the same thing that, let's say, a tribe is going to consider archaeologically important, or a built environment is considered important to keep. And so I think we need to, even though we need to respect their perspective, we also need to remember that we're coming from an archaeological perspective. Our job is not to say what's important in more of the esoteric idea, if that makes sense.
It does indeed. And on that note, I think we're going to take our first break, and be sure to check out, as I mentioned in the beginning, go check out arcpodnet.com and check out the members page to become a member and to continue this conversation with myself and our hosts and other members on our Slack team. Back in a second. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code CRMARC. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode. Welcome back to the Sierra Mark Podcast, episode 193. And Doug, we didn't hear from you last segment, but I'm curious as to your thoughts on this subject, especially since you were a U.S. archaeologist for a while down in New Mexico in the Southwest. And now you've been living and working over in the UK for a while. So how do you see this concept of good faith effort?
So my experience with it has been at a much more technical level and much more detailed on sort of the logistics and the legality of it. So in a sense of, in the United States, almost, I'm sure there's going to be exceptions to this, but most federal laws and regulations are a process-based situation in that you may not like the answer that comes at the end of the process, but as long as the process is followed, you can't really appeal it. And of course, that's the great thing about the Trump administration is the vast majority of them are idiots and haven't been following most of the regulations. And so, I mean, if they'd had halfway competent people, they probably would have rolled back all our ecological and cultural heritage laws by now, because all you have to do is go through the process, and it's not about, you know, the outcome. It's just going through the process. And so the dealings with, like, you know, best effort and all that has come up quite a bit locally for where I was working in New Mexico. So there was actually a bit before I started becoming an archaeologist, there's been a lot of fights with the local sort of pueblos, local groups, and, you know, we sort of touched on it, but the idea that, you know, they'll identify religious areas and historical sites and things that are important to them, which may not necessarily be what archaeologists look for. And of course, that runs into problems because, you know, it's not just necessarily, we're not always looking for 100% archaeological remains when we're doing our evaluations and everything. It's meant to be a bit more broad than that. And so there's, I remember before I started, Sandia Pueblo, which is just outside of Albuquerque, got in a huge fight with the Forest Service because they basically passed along that there was religious sites in a certain area, but because the Forest Service couldn't identify them, they just said, oh, well, they don't exist. And so the good faith came into the process, and the process was, if someone had told you that they exist there, you need to go and investigate. And so I remember they got overturned on this, and I got pushed back because it was the good faith in the part that basically they didn't follow the process. So the process should have been, someone's told you that something exists there, you need to go through the process of being able to pass that information on. And I think it came down to is they didn't pass on that information to the SHPO, and the SHPO made a recommendation, but because they hadn't included the information, it got overturned. So it was all about the process. And that's been my experience with sort of the good faith, is it's mainly about the process. So as long as you're going through the process, you're pretty much in good legal standing for anything you do in terms of, you know, laws in the United States. And so that's basically been my experience. Is it's good faith it's mainly saying that you haven't done anything. I think Heather said it best at the beginning of of our last segment about, you know, you weren't doing anything shady. You were basically going through the entire process and doing the best you can with the best intentions. And yeah, that's basically been my experience with good faith, is it's about the process, and whether you end up with what you wanted at the end of that process doesn't matter too much, as long as you're undertaking that process in the right way. So that goes back to, like, what was it, Trump, and they tried to, the citizenship question on the census, and they messed it up because they could have normally have gotten that through, but they didn't put the correct reasoning down and withheld information. And because that violated the process, they didn't get that into the censorship. But if they'd actually not been shady about it, they could have easily got that in, because it's just the process.
Yeah.
So I've probably said process like 40 times in like the last 2 minutes.
Which I think is appropriate. That's appropriate. That's a good focus.
That's right.
To jump on, yeah. I think the important thing, though, is that, you know, what Doug's talking about, as Bill pointed out in the previous segment, there's this process, but the process is heavily, well, it's entirely the agency's process. That Section 106 and the whole Section 106 process, and I'm just going to keep saying process, That's in
It's addicting.
CFR 800.
Once you start, Stephen, you can't stop. Trust me.
Hey, that's the name of my blog, man. I got to plug it, even though I haven't written anything in, I don't know, 4 years. But yeah, it's like this whole like 36 CFR 800 process is oriented towards the agencies. And so when it gets down to the actual, like, us, those of us on the show, like, we're out there in the field, putting shovels in the ground and walking all over the place and looking for stuff. Like, it doesn't immediately apply to what we're doing. There are certain requirements in 36 CFR 800 that do directly apply to us, but for the most part, it's on the agency, and we are literally like a tick box in this list of things that they have to do and consider. And part of that is the whole collaboration thing and consultation, which is conceived of as, people talking to the government about, like, here's this undertaking and we have to do this. And how that trickles down to us, the contractors, the consultants, is not always well established. Depending on where you're working, the SHPO will have guidelines of how you are expected to apply what we do in the day-to-day to this overarching process. But I think that at some points, particularly with certain agencies that are not really actively invested in doing this so much as just passing the buck along to the private developers, sometimes the guidance isn't where it should be.
I agree. I think that when it comes to following the process, where things usually go sideways, to me, I've seen over the years is in the budget. So that's the almighty dollar. It does run our projects, and it does, even for the best of archaeologists, it's that little devil on one of our shoulders saying, you don't have budget for this, and you only have enough budget to have so many people out in the field. And so I think that the best way to make sure that you do adhere to a good faith effort is that your proposal, your work plan is well thought out, and your budget is well thought out. And, I've had projects that I've bid on that have been, where the process is considered and all the agency requirements are considered and been underbid by other people. And it's almost always, if I'm able to see their bid, sometimes you are, it's always been that it was because they didn't follow the process, and they were able to underbid because they were cutting out some of those steps. And so I do think that the key to having a good faith effort is to make sure that your work plan and that your proposal is in line with that to begin with. Because when you get out there, now you don't have a budget, it's hard to explain to your company or to yourself, if you're self-employed, that you have to eat some tasks because now you have to follow a process. And I know I even had to keep, I've picked up numerous projects where I've had to clean up the mess of somebody who did not plan for that process ahead of time. So that would be maybe something a little bit more concrete, is that the effort to make sure that you have a good faith effort starts with the proposal and your work plan.
We're almost pushing into a sort of moral aspect of good faith. So the United States and several other countries are common law, and that's based off of precedent. And so that's what happened before. And so unfortunately, when we come to like good faith effort, if something was subpar in the past, good faith in the legal sense is subpar in the future and currently. So if someone, like, if they're like, oh, they went out and they did, I don't know how many linear miles of whatever survey, and they only found like five sites. I don't know, 5 sites per 50 miles or something pretty crappy. There's going to be more sites than that. But because it's happened once, if it goes to the court system and it's like, they're like that, and they could hold it up and they're going to be like, well, look, we did that same sort of thing, only found 5 sites per, 50 linear miles and stuff, which we probably know is they're just going too fast, and because someone had underbid and decided that, you need to make 10 hours every day hiking through rough terrain. So you're just blowing through an incredible pace and there's no time to record anything. And you're going along, you're like, oh guys, it's just that site is just outside our project area. So we're not going to record it. We're skipping through. But in a sense, that is good faith, because you're meeting the very minimum requirements set out by precedent. And if the precedent is pretty poor, you're okay with that in the legal sense, which is a shame, because I wish we had a different sort of legal aspect other than good faith. I don't know. And this is where we're talking about sort of morals and a higher standard, in the sense of it'd be great if there's a legal way to say that you should always be aiming for the highest possible standard. And that means that in the future, the standard will change and probably be harder or higher, or I don't know, however you want to set your standards, and that you should be aiming for that. I wish that was the case, because I think legally it's all based on precedent. So as soon as someone gets away with being accepted as that is the bare minimum that you need to do to get the project done inside the process, then I think we're kind of stuck with that, which I think is a great shame. Because if we could hold everyone to a higher standard, and it would be legally enforceable. So in the sense of good faith, if we somehow change the meaning of good faith in relation to our heritage laws, and good faith meant setting the highest standard possible, as opposed to doing I'm not going to say the bare minimum, but it pretty much comes down to the bare minimum. That's what I'd like to see. But, I don't run the world, unfortunately.
Well, fortunately.
Oh, burn, Stephen, burn.
Thank you. To kind of go off that, I feel like Doug's example of we only found 5 sites in so many areas. I don't think the results of findings is the precedent-setting thing, quality. I think it's more in the process of what did you do to look for sites, and it's like shovel testing on a certain interval. And if the SHPO allows you to get away with doing a 30-meter interval of shovel tests when normally it's 15 meters, then that could be an issue, right? Unless it was an extenuating circumstance, and it's actually kind of hashed out in programmatically or whatever, that it's okay, in this case, because it's, I don't know, an environmental disaster, you get to do a wider spread or tailor it more towards the specific APE rather than doing the default standard. However, that doesn't really apply to you only found 1 site, or versus usually you would find 10 sites, and it's if you followed the procedure of what the standards are for field work and you only found 1 site, I mean, that might be really weird, but that wouldn't be precedent setting. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I should also say that I'm basing this off of, again, when I was very starting out, there was a project that was given to, I think it was just an environmental firm with no archaeologists on it. And they were meant to do the archaeology survey. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was something like they were supposed to survey 800 acres or something like that. And they found nothing. And so then the SHPO went out there. I think within 5 minutes, they'd found a site. in this area that's supposedly been surveyed. So it's this weird, like with archaeology, there's rarely anyone there to check. So part of it comes down to your results, because like, I don't know, it's tough because you could say you did the process, and yeah, that's true that like some areas will have a lot more sites than others. It's also one of those things where you could say you go through the process and you probably actually didn't know what you were doing and failed, and that could still, you could be brought up on probably good faith in that example because they didn't actually have a single archaeologist working on it when they should have. But so that was just the example that came to my head, was because that was the example of where they basically went back and they said, you guys, you didn't do a good job. You're not getting paid. And I think there was a whole bunch of legal action around it and stuff. But it just basically came down to non-archaeologists went out to do an archaeology survey and didn't find anything. And so the implication is they did it wrong. Mm-hmm. But I mean, since no one was there, no one actually knows, did they do it right or did they do it wrong? Which is, I mean, yeah, it's like with most of our excavations and our surveys and stuff like that, we actually put a lot of faith in our fellow archaeologists that what they're finding, they say they're finding. And when they didn't find anything, that there wasn't actually anything there, which, that's rough. That's a lot of faith we have in our fellow archaeologists.
It is indeed. All right. And on that note, we will take our final break and come back on the other side. Hey, while you're listening to these advertisements and mostly promos that we have for the Archaeology Podcast Network, if this is July 2020, just keep in mind that you can always contact our advertising manager, Madison, which is advertising@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com, to get your job postings, advertisements, field schools, whatever you want, up here on the APN at a pretty reasonable price. But contact her, advertising@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Back in a second. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. All right, welcome back to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 193. And we are talking about several concepts. We've just spent the last two segments talking about what it means to make a good faith effort recording an archaeological site, highlighting the fact that it's a difficult concept to grasp, to be honest, and that needs to be really thought out and analyzed. So, but now we're going to switch gears a little bit in segment 3 here and talk about something that really is tied to that, to be honest. And that is the concept of, is everything important? Some people want to go out there and record everything on an archaeology site. Some people don't, right? Some people want to sample. Some people don't like sampling strategies. They think it's just lazy. I think personally that a lot of sampling strategies are based on funding, not necessarily science in a lot of cases, which is probably true, because a lot of our practices in archaeology are based on funding, to be honest. But, when you have the ability to do something like, I'll give you guys an example. We recorded an archaeology site just a few weeks ago. It was a small lithic scatter. Well, not terribly small, but it was a small lithic scatter. And the application that I was using to record, and there's only two of us. So one of us was recording, we both flagged it out. One of us was recording the actual lithic debitage assemblage, and one of us was, and the tools actually. And then I was doing the site record and the GIS stuff, right? And taking the photos. Now, here's something we mostly do. If you've got less than, say, 20, 30, 40 flakes or something on a site, then you're probably going to record all of them on paper, right? You're not on paper, in WildNote or in some other digital platform. But you're going to look at probably all those lithics and you're going to say, do I have a primary, secondary, tertiary? Don't get me started on how those are defined, but you're probably going to write down each one of those and give a little tick mark and say what you have next to that. But how many people go and actually take a GPS point on every single one of those? Probably not that many. And in fact, I know a lot of people who would take a GPS point on none of those except for the tools. And then you end up with this 200 meter by 200 meter kidney bean that has 2 points on it. One of them's a tool and one of them's a datum, and that's it. And there's no other data. And my guess is the reason for that is time. It usually is. It's like somebody decided way back when that we're not going to put non-diagnostics on the GPS and map those, and that's it, right? So, but I had the ability with the system I was using to actually record every point, and I had time because again there was only two of us. So while my colleague was writing down everything else about analysis, I had finished the GIS, finished most of the site record, and I went around and I just dropped a point on every single lithic, and now we have a nice comprehensive map that shows everything that's on there. But not everybody does that, and that's not really the point of is everything important anyway. But it really did make me think about it. But what is important to record, and I'll just kick this discussion off with current times here in July of 2020. There are a lot of things that are or were considered historical at some point that are now considered offensive and racist, and they're being taken down, and they're no longer important to us culturally. They're important historically, but they're not important to us socially right now, to keep in their current configuration, to keep in their current place, and to keep in their current, I guess, place of respect and honor. Right? They're still in the history books, but they're coming down as something that is, standing for everybody to see. So thinking about that, thinking about archaeological sites, thinking of your basic lithic scatter or can scatter or something like that, what is important? What's important now may not be important in 50 years. What's important now may not have been important 50 years ago, right? So what's important now, and how do we determine that? Who wants to jump into this soup next? Bill raised his hand. That's first. Right. He wins the game.
Yeah, I was going to say I'll jump into. Everybody, I beat them all to it. It's all right. I mean, when it comes to CRM and what we're doing out there, it depends on the regulatory context under which you're working, right? So if you have things that are 50 years old, intact, I can't. We can go over this for a long time. Whether 5 flakes in a ceramic of older than 50 years old within X amount of meters equals a site. I mean, I've recorded a lot of that stuff in my life, but I recorded that stuff because of the regulatory context under which I was working. So if you're given a job and part of your job has a statue that's racist or whatever, and it's older than 50 years, intact, can convey its significance and all those other things, and is plays a role in local history, then that thing should be recorded as a feature or as an object, or however else you want to argue it out in your site description or whatever. And after that, then it's up to the community to decide whether they're going to commemorate those things or not, because those battles continue going forever. Taking all of these statues down 100 and something years from now, we may actually, in fact, remember how we did something that we didn't think was a good idea, and then want to create some kind of 3D model or memorial to the act of actually taking them down. I mean, there's a million things that we could see happening. If you've ever been to many of the major European museums, you can see an entire wall from Babylon in the, I can't remember, I think it's the Pergamon, maybe I'm misspeaking, but in Berlin, I remember seeing, huge sections of Assyrian artifacts and entire walls from what's now Iraq that were taken away and are set up and are now the patrimony of another culture, another nation, that at this time it's been there for more than 100 years. So it's actually, in fact, a historic object in that town that's been removed. And we have a, long history of empires and rulers and folks taking things from certain cultures, taking their cultural objects away and moving them to somewhere else. And then after time going on, those becoming a part of that culture's history. So if you just stick to the rules and you record things the way that it's spoken or outlined in what you're supposed to be doing for that project, then that's what you're doing. Because I can't tell you how many times my entire career in Arizona was based on people not caring about historic roads or railroads, or not caring at all about historic artifact scatters and stuff, and just refusing to learn how to identify glass. By doing that, I was given a job because I could actually record those things. Now, did I think a mound of 1,200 rusting cans in the middle of the desert was a, beyond significant site? That was up to the land managing agency or the folks that were going to pay me to excavate each one of those cans stratigraphically to figure out, right? But my job as recording that stuff and making those recommendations to our clients, it was kind of outlined in the regulations under which I was working and the stipulations of the contract.
I concur totally. It is our first, and every time I think of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, I have Tom King in my head don't use phases. We're looking at a step. First, we're trying to see, do we have something here? Second is our evaluation of significance, and then what are we going to do from there? That's a real simple, 1, 2, 3. But the first thing that we do is we should be looking for artifacts, and we should be recording, just like Bill says. We should be recording. We shouldn't be assigning importance to it. It's what happens later, then that's when it gets a little sticky, and we bring in stakeholders and we have a conversation of, we obviously make our recommendations of significance, but there's a lot more people that are involved with that conversation, and the system is set up that way on purpose. So with that being said, the conversation of importance, I am a true believer that in the field, I'm not making that decision. In the field, I am just writing down what I find. And I know that, we are limited by budget, but that's where planning comes in. There's no reason why you can't, people can't devise systems. So I know we have our system, the company I work with, and I have my personal system with the crews that I lead, is that when we go out in the field, you can very efficiently record everything you see. There's no reason why you can't do that. And the only reason you wouldn't be able to do that is because you didn't prepare ahead of time, and you don't have a good work plan. And also, and I know Chris would concur, is you have to have the proper technologies, and they don't all have to cost a lot of money. But if you have the proper technology, there's no reason why you can't record everything you see. And that's where, to me, the conversation of if something important or not doesn't come into play, in my mind, in the field. You record what you have. It's almost like you look at just the onset of DNA analysis in the last 20 years, and the things that have, the crimes that have been able to be solved because people kept boxes of evidence. It always boggles my mind when I'm watching these crime stories. Who in the world would have thought to keep some of the things that they keep? But they did, because even though they had no idea how it was going to be used, they knew that they should keep it, and that they are not going to assign importance to it, or whether or not it's going to play a role in solving a crime. They are just collecting information so that the more specific conversation of importance has as much information as possible, so it can be informed properly.
To riff off of Heather, I totally agree. One thing that actually makes me very sad is what we don't record. So like the soil, unless you're doing an excavation, even then you pretty much have to have like a geoarchaeologist there. I can't remember this is maybe 10 years ago. I was reading someone so he's they were a bit biased. They're geoarchaeologists, but they're like, yeah, in 30 years, we're going to look back and we're going to be like, man, they threw out all the soil. How could they have done that? Because, there's a lot of stuff that like we record because it's what we recorded 50 years ago, which is, lithics, tin cans. Well, okay, maybe not. That's gotten a little bit more recent with historical stuff. That's become more acceptable to record. Because, if you think about it, like, oh man, early archaeology, like all the stuff that they did during the Depression, those big employment schemes and stuff, how they had to excavate like an entire pueblo, like a 150-room pueblo in like a week or something. And they just tear through stuff, and they only kept like the intact pots. And that was basically it. They pretty much just toss away everything else, and they just keep like the sort of treasure hunting and important stuff. It's like Kidder when he came out to Chaco Canyon, like all the stuff that got sent back to the Smithsonian in the late 1800s, early 1900s from the Southwest. They like amazing stuff, but you're just wondering like, God, how much did they just destroy? That like today we'd be like, oh my God, if we had that information, that'd be amazing. I wish like when we were out recording, we'd also be like super annoying to everyone who's doing it. I know, but like if you're doing like a shovel test pit and stuff, it'd be great if people like also like sampled the soil as well. Because taking back like 50 pounds of soil is everyone's dream in your backpack, but I do think like Heather was completely on the point. Like, you just don't know what you're going to need. But even now, you talk to a geoarchaeologist and they're like, oh, phytoliths and pollen and all sorts of things we can tell about the past from just the soil. And you're like, we probably should be doing a lot more with like what we already have now, knowing what we know.
Yeah. Well, and again, most of that, like I was saying in the beginning, comes down to budget, right? Like if we collected everything we possibly could off a site, I mean, who's going to store that? Who's going to pay for it? I'm reminded of digs over in the, like Greece and Italy and places like that, up in that whole area. I've interviewed people before that have said, we just got to chunk through, 5 feet of Roman pottery that we literally throw in the trash before we can get to the prehistoric stuff. Because they're just like, this stuff is a dime a dozen. It's everywhere. You've got feet and feet and feet of Roman pottery to dig through. And, if we had endless resources and endless ability to keep that stuff and then endless analytical abilities later on, we might find some analysis on the inside of a pot that, some plant or something that was cultivated and now we have evidence for it, or I don't know, some crazy thing. Again, how important is that? I don't know. It adds to the story, which is our job as archaeologists, is basically to add to the story, add to the picture of history. And it's what's important right now. That's really what all this boils down to, is that's what's important. It's what's important right now. What question am I trying to answer? And I think that's what gets us into trouble sometimes. Like both of you guys have said, I'm always reminded too of another Chaco Canyon story where they can't really do, what was it? They can't really do carbon-14 analysis on some of the fire pits inside the Pueblo Bonito structure and some of the others, because when those early people visited there, the early Westerners, they built fires where they saw evidence of fires before. So they destroyed the carbon-14 potential of those particular hearths. And because obviously carbon-14 hadn't been invented yet and wouldn't be invented for like 100 years. So yeah, it's tough to know.
This kind of leads to another concept that I think is talked about a lot, and that is preservation over excavation, or excavation over preservation. So,
Sure.
when we are recording, and let's say we're not doing testing, and I know you were saying you're not crazy about the sampling and sometimes, but I think we can't sample the whole thing. Also, sampling allows us to preserve, but that's where we need to remember we're coming against right now a curatorial problem right now, where there's just not enough space. And now we're starting, at least in California, there's a conversation of not holding within certain universities any collections of Native American artifacts. And so now, we're getting to the point where we're not going to be. So we're collecting with the idea that we might have technology in the future that can give us more information. Well, maybe we need to really consider, and we need to start considering not excavating. And I know that's against what we think, but it really shouldn't be excavating unless there's a need for an excavation. Because what we're doing is we all, what do they say? Archaeologists kill their informants or something like that, whatever that is said when you're in school. But as soon as we dig, it can't be dug again, right? So should we always be digging? Should we always be, sampling? Obviously, we're looking at the impacts, but if maybe we shouldn't be jumping to that right away. Maybe that should be obviously a case by case basis, but based on the project. If that project's not going to go through, or if it has a potential that it might not go through, should we be jumping to that excavation right away if it isn't absolutely necessary? So I know that in consultations with Native American entities, they are now wanting us to rebury, rather than curate artifacts, to actually rebury them. So now everything that we're collecting, we're not going to learn from anything anyway. So I do think that maybe in some ways we need to start looking at exactly when we excavate. We need to be looking at that more thoroughly now and not just jump to that.
All right, well, we are out of time. Stephen and Doug, do you have a quick final comment for this?
Yeah, and Heather was kind of touching on it at the end, and this might be a topic we want to kind of pursue for a later episode or something like that. But I think the big question is, do we need to come to grips with the idea that, like, we don't actually need to keep everything? Like, we record it, we get rid of it, And because it's not actually, the stuff is not what's important. And that's an avenue, like, I mean, there will be a lot of hand-wringing about it, but that's something that we need to start considering.
Right.
So I'm going to jump in with my last quick in the last minute. Just to say, like, maybe we're looking at it the wrong way. Maybe we're looking at it as our resources being constrained, but maybe we should be constraining development. So in the sense of maybe we should be saving every last thing, but that means that, you know, because of space and money and all that stuff, maybe we should be building a little less. Like, you know, if we're only doing archaeology, if we decide to keep everything, so if archaeology is super important, maybe it's a sign that, like, we don't need that, like, 400th millionth pipeline, especially as it's destroying the world with global warming. But I'm just wondering, like, if we completely twisted this around, just said, like, yeah, actually we should keep everything, and that's the constraint. And so the constraint is archaeology. So when people are thinking about, like, ooh, we need to build this stuff, ooh, you know, we're going to have to, like, really worry about the archaeology, and we can't build too much because then we'll have too much archaeology and we don't have enough space and it's going to be really expensive. You know, just, I wonder if we were to switch it that way. I'll leave it with that, is like, it'd be really cool if, like, instead of trying to sample, we actually do just save everything. It actually means that we put constraints on other people and not ourselves.
All right. That's a good point to end on, and we will do that. So check out our show notes. We've got a couple links in there that we've mentioned. And again, extend the conversation. Keep having this. We could keep debating these topics for a while, and you can do it on our members only Slack teams. So head on over to archpodnet.com for information on becoming a member for just the cost of really less than your Netflix account. So that's it. You can get Disney Plus, watch Hamilton, and then go get an ArchPodNet membership and have a conversation about archaeology. There you go. All right. Back next week with some more great topics. I don't know what they're going to be, but they'll be fantastic. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question in a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and all but Doug. We'll see you in the field. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thanks for listening.
Doug's already in the field.
Doug said goodbye at the exact same time. Yeah, I didn't even notice it.
I was the first one there. I was the first one there.
Sorry, listeners. I ruined it this time.
We're out. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.